Family and friends gathered to console me. I was standing by his graveside, clutching a handful of white lilies, when I heard the commotion. Turning around, I saw her Mrs. Joyce. She was storming toward me, her face twisted in fury.
You! How dare you go behind my back to Mr. Patel? You're trying to get me fired, aren't you?
Before I could react, she grabbed a handful of my hair and yanked me so hard that I fell. Then she picked up a stick and started hitting my son's coffin and chasing the guests. Luckily, my brothers managed to tackle her and stop her from causing further damage.
Tell these brats to let me go, and if anything happens to my job, you'll join your useless son.
My brothers dragged her out of the venue. The school used to be a safe space for me, a place where I could channel my passion for teaching into something meaningful. But when Mrs. Joyce became our head teacher, everything changed. It was like a shadow had fallen over our once thriving school. Mrs. Joyce arrived shortly after Mr. Carlton retired. Mr. Carlton had been the heart of the school, a leader who genuinely cared about his staff and students. He knew our names, our struggles, and our joys.
Take care of yourself first, Layla. Your well-being matters as much as your teaching.
I still remember the farewell party we threw for him. He was humble, overwhelmed by our gratitude.
I appreciate you all. Don't stop working hard, and while you're at it, ensure you're taking care of yourselves.
I carried his words with me, even as Mrs. Joyce arrived and began dismantling everything he had built. At first, she seemed promising. She swept into the school with sharp suits and sharper words, speaking of efficiency and improvements. But it didn't take long to see her true nature. The first hint came when she reorganized the staff lounge. Gone were the cozy chairs and personal touches we'd added over the years. In their place were sterile white tables and a large sign that read, "Staff meetings only, no loitering." She implemented a slew of new rules that made the school feel more like a prison than a workplace. We were required to submit lesson plans weeks in advance for her approval, and any deviation from those plans required a written explanation. One day, she caught me grading papers during my lunch break.
Your lunch break is for eating, not slacking off. If you're behind on grading, that's your fault.
I wanted to argue, to explain that I was trying to stay ahead for my students, but the look in her eyes warned me to stay silent. Her reign of terror extended far beyond petty rules. She seemed to take pleasure in humiliating us. During a staff meeting, she singled out Mrs. Patel, a senior teacher who had been with the school for over 20 years.
Your students' test scores are unacceptable. If you can't handle the curriculum, perhaps it's time to reconsider your career.
Mrs. Patel's face had turned red, and she stammered an apology. It broke my heart to see her so shaken. Mrs. Patel was one of the kindest, most dedicated teachers I knew, and Joyce had reduced her to tears. Another time, Mr. Harris, our history teacher, requested a day off to attend his father's surgery. He submitted the request well in advance, but Mrs. Joyce denied it without explanation.
If every teacher ran off at the first sign of a family issue, this school would fall apart. Your job comes first.
The rest of us rallied around Mr. Harris, offering to cover his classes so he could be with his father. But Mrs. Joyce caught wind of it and put a stop to our plan.
You're here to teach, not to play favorites. Mr. Harris will manage.
The worst incident, before my own tragedy, involved Miss Turner, a young teacher who was employed a few weeks before Joyce. She had accidentally left her classroom door unlocked over the weekend, and a stray cat had gotten inside. It didn't cause any damage, but Mrs. Joyce used the opportunity to make an example out of her.
This level of carelessness is unacceptable. If you can't follow basic protocols, you're a liability to this institution.
Before we knew it, Miss Turner was slapped. Miss Turner was forced to write an apology letter to the entire staff and take unpaid leave for 2 weeks. As if that wasn't enough, when she returned, Joyce banned her from speaking to other teachers to help her focus more. It was ridiculous. The students weren't spared from Mrs. Joyce's tyranny either. She implemented strict rules for them, banning colorful backpacks, personal decorations on lockers, and even birthday celebrations in classrooms. I remember one day when one of the students named Sam came to school with a homemade birthday hat. He was so excited to show it off, but Mrs. Joyce confiscated it immediately.
We're here to learn, not to celebrate frivolities. Your parents must be foolish to think this is a place for such nonsense.
Sam had burst into tears, and I spent the rest of the day trying to console him. Still, we endured. We whispered our frustrations in the hallways, shared knowing glances during her tirades, and did our best to protect our students from her wrath. Then, the unthinkable happened. My son's condition worsened. He had been battling a rare illness for years, and though we had always known this day might come, nothing could prepare me for the finality of it. The morning he passed, I was numb with grief. I called the school, barely able to speak through my tears. When Mrs. Joyce answered, I explained what had happened, expecting at least a semblance of compassion.
I'm sorry for your loss, Layla, but this school cannot function if teachers leave every time there's a personal issue. You need to decide what's more important, your job or your emotions.
My son just died. I need to be with my family.
And your students need a teacher. If you leave, don't expect to come back. You're not the first to lose a child. Neither will you be the last. Don't be foolish, Layla. I expected more from you than this silliness.
I hung up the phone, shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I couldn't fathom how someone could be so cruel, so utterly devoid of humanity. At that moment, I realized just how much the school had changed since Mrs. Joyce arrived. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It had become a battlefield, and I was too broken to keep fighting. That day, I made two decisions. First, I would attend my son's funeral, no matter what it cost me. And second, I would find a way to stand up to Mrs. Joyce, not just for myself, but for everyone she had hurt. When I finally gathered the courage to call the school's owner, Mr. Patel, it felt like my last shot at justice. Mr. Patel, I wouldn't have reached out if it wasn't urgent. My son passed away yesterday, and I need 3 days to organize his funeral.
Layla, I'm so sorry for your loss, but why are you asking me for leave? Shouldn't you have spoken to Mrs. Joyce about this?
I did, sir. I told her what happened, but she refused to let me go. She said if I left, I shouldn't expect to come back to work. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to wonder if he had hung up. Finally, he spoke, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice.
I can't believe this. I trusted Mrs. Joyce to lead the school with compassion and integrity. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Layla. Take all the time you need. You have a week to mourn your son, and I'll make sure you're paid in full.
Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the lingering bitterness. Mrs. Joyce had pushed me to my limit, but at least for now, I could focus on saying goodbye to my son. The next day, which was my son's funeral, was the hardest day of my life. Family and friends gathered to console me. I was standing by his graveside, clutching a handful of white lilies, when I heard the commotion. Turning around, I saw her Mrs. Joyce. She was storming toward me, her face twisted in fury.
You! How dare you go behind my back to Mr. Patel? You're trying to get me fired, aren't you?
Before I could react, she grabbed a handful of my hair and yanked me so hard that I fell. Then she picked up a stick and started hitting my son's coffin and chasing the guests. Luckily, my brothers managed to tackle her and stop her from causing further damage.
Tell these brats to let me go, and if anything happens to my job, you'll join your useless son.
My brothers dragged her out of the venue. My brothers wanted to do more, but I begged them to let it go, at least for now. I wouldn't let her ruin this moment of closure for my son. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let it end there. The next day, I was ready to deal with her. She humiliated me at my son's funeral. There was no way I would let her get away with it. She needed to pay. I told my brothers about my desire for revenge. They didn't need any convincing. I knew the quiet route Mrs. Joyce always took home after work. That evening, we waited there. When I saw her approaching, we stepped out. When she saw us, I could tell she was afraid, but she tried to play fearless.
What are you doing here, you witch?
We're here to teach you manners since you apparently lack one. We didn't hold back. My brothers pinned her arms while I beat her up. She screamed and begged, but I felt no pity. After everything she had done, this was justice. By the time we were done, she was bruised and sobbing. A week later, I returned to work. But I wasn't just going back as the same Layla. I needed everyone to see the consequences of Mrs. Joyce's actions. Using makeup, I created realistic bruises on my face and wrapped a bandage around my arm. When I walked into the school, the whispers began immediately.
Did you see Layla? She looks terrible.
What could have happened to her?
I announced the truth to everyone, or at least a version of it. Mrs. Joyce came to my son's funeral and attacked me. I couldn't even mourn in peace. The outrage was immediate. By the time Mrs. Joyce arrived later that morning, the entire school was in an uproar. Students threw garbage at her, shouting insults. Teachers blocked her from entering the office, demanding she be fired. She tried to defend herself, but no one was listening.
We've had enough of you. Leave. You're nothing but a bully.
Mr. Patel arrived shortly afterward. One of the teachers had called him. When he saw my fake injuries, he was shocked and angry.
Mrs. Joyce, is this true? Did you assault Layla at her son's funeral?
Of course not. She's lying.
I pulled out my phone. Thankfully, when she stormed the funeral that day, someone had taken a very short video. I showed it to Mr. Patel, and he was even more shocked.
She's twisting the story. Don't believe her, please.
But the staff and students were on my side. They recounted every cruel thing she had done since becoming head teacher, painting a vivid picture of her tyranny. In the end, Mr. Patel made his decision.
Mrs. Joyce, you're fired. I can't have a cruel person like you leading my school. I don't ever want to see you near this school again. And as for your salary this month, it's going to Layla to help with her medical expenses.
Mrs. Joyce burst out crying. She begged Mr. Patel, but he refused to take back his words. She left in disgrace, running away as the students jeered and threw more trash at her. Mr. Patel asked me to step in as acting head teacher. At first, I was hesitant, but with the support of my colleagues, I accepted the role. The atmosphere in the school changed almost overnight. The tension lifted, and for the first time in months, it felt like a safe place again. 2 weeks later, Mr. Patel made it official.
Layla, you've done an incredible job. The staff and students clearly respect you. I'd like to make you the permanent head teacher.
I accepted, grateful for the opportunity to lead with the kindness and compassion Mrs. Joyce had lacked. It wasn't long before I heard the final piece of news about her. Her husband had left her, unable to cope with her unemployment. Apparently, her husband married her because she was rich and could take care of him. They had also been trying for a child but had no luck. When she was fired, her husband stole her money and vanished. Behind her evil front, she was nothing but a pathetic loser. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.
I can't even look at him. He freaks me out. I'm sorry if this discomforts you both, but we can't go back to the house with him. Even worse, Freddie is afraid of how he looks. He can barely bring his friends home.
My grandparents were livid.
How can you say such in front of your son? Just because he has a disease doesn't make him scary.
I feel ashamed. How can you both be so selfish and heartless? He's your son just as much as Freddie is. If you leave him here today, I promise you, I will not allow you both have any rights over him.
We never wanted it. We're fine with Freddie. You can both keep the sick one. He might die soon anyway. Those itchy patches will drive him crazy. You can deal with it.
My name is Ollie, and I suffer from a skin condition called psoriasis. I was born with it, and apparently, my parents didn't like that. The disease caused red and scaly patches on my skin, giving me a rough look. My twin brother, Freddie, on the other hand, didn't have it. He was born with great skin and a more handsome face. He also had jet black curly hair, while I had ginger, straight, and thin hair. I envied my brother a lot. While growing up, my parents were very clear about who they loved the most among us. While they made me wear thick clothes that didn't show any skin, my brother was free to wear whatever he wanted. The thick clothes they made me wear caused irritation to my skin and made my condition even worse. When we were out, I would try to take in the discomfort and control myself until we were home. Sometimes I succeeded. Other times, I didn't. On days like that, I would burst into tears, begging them to take some of the clothes off. However, my parents would refuse and silence me. They didn't want anyone knowing about my condition, so they preferred to have me crying and in discomfort than to help me. It got to a point where they stopped taking me with them, as even my cries were embarrassing for them. Although it hurt to see them taking just my brother, I was relieved to be at home. My brother, on the other hand, rarely spoke to me. He'd requested to be in a different room around the time we were 6. According to him, He felt uncomfortable around me and had nightmares about me turning into a monster. Of course, my parents had us separated. Once we began sleeping in different rooms, my brother became a completely different person. He refused to speak to me and only did when he needed to warn me against getting closer to him. I tried to speak to him about his behavior and preach about love between siblings, but he was quick to shut me up.
I'm not your brother. I can't be brothers with a monster like you. Don't you see how different we look?
Truthfully, we were different. We had only a slight resemblance. Most people hardly believed we were twins. After failing to talk to him, I decided to back off completely. I was alone in my family. About the time when my twin and I were 9, my parents stopped me from eating with them in the dining room. According to their reason, Freddie was scared of my condition since it was getting worse. But it isn't contagious. I heard the doctor say that.
Well, your brother is scared and the only thing we can do is protect him. Honestly, I also don't believe the doctor's words. I can't have you infecting us with this.
I'd never felt so hurt and betrayed. I began eating in my room all alone. Even worse, they got me separate dishes and cutlery, as they didn't want me sharing theirs for fear of contracting my disease. It was enough that I was bullied at school for it, but it was unfair that even my family were doing the same. I was treated as though I had the worst disease ever. One afternoon, I was in my room when I heard someone enter the house. I'd been waiting for my parents, as I needed to tell them about some things I had to get at school. Once I heard the door open, I rushed out of my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to speak to them if they weren't in the living room, as I was prohibited from going into their room. However, on getting to the living room, instead of my parents, I met my brother with a young girl about our age, and 3 boys who had tough expressions on.
What the hell are you doing? Who asked you to come out?
I explained to him my reason for being in the living room, but he didn't believe.
I know you did this intentionally. You came out to embarrass me before my friends with your disease.
I couldn't believe him. How could he think I'd intentionally bring myself out to his friends? I mean, Freddie wasn't as smart as him, so I never expected him to be highly sensible. But I didn't think he'd be so dumb. He yelled at me and asked me to return to my room. I didn't argue. I immediately turned away and went back to my hole. It continued that way until I was 10, and my family decided that they'd had enough of me and needed me out of their lives. Firstly, they stopped me from going to school because my flare-ups had gotten worse. I thought they'd get me a home tutor, but they didn't do that. My education was paused indefinitely, and I was left alone at home every day while my parents went to work and my brother school. 2 months later, it was my and Freddie's birthday. I'd anticipated a little celebration since it was our 10th one, but I got disappointed. On our birthday, while I got locked in my room, a birthday party was held for my twin. I didn't get any wishes or even a cake from my parents. All I got was a bowl of cereal, and I was forgotten for the rest of the day until the next morning.
Make the house sparkling clean before we return home.
I was so pissed. How could they ignore me and still make me clean after the celebration? I would refuse, but I couldn't bring myself to disobey my mother. I cleaned everywhere like I'd been asked to, and quickly returned to my room afterward. About 3 months later, they took me with them to my grandparents. They hadn't seen me for a while, so they were shocked to see how bad my condition was. As they were offering ways to help me control it, my parents suddenly stood up.
We have to leave now. We didn't plan to stay for long.
I'd felt bad and wondered why they brought me if it was going to be so short. My grandparents were also vocal about not wanting me to leave soon. My parents' next words shocked me.
We're not going with him. We're leaving him here with you. We can't take care of him any longer.
I can't even look at him. He freaks me out. I'm sorry if this discomforts you both, but we can't go back to the house with him. Even worse, Freddie is afraid of how he looks. He can barely bring his friends home.
My grandparents were livid.
How can you say such in front of your son? Just because he has a disease doesn't make him scary.
I feel ashamed. How can you both be so selfish and heartless? He's your son just as much as Freddie is. If you leave him here today, I promise you, I will not allow you both have any rights over him.
We never wanted it. We're fine with Freddie. You can both keep the sick one. He might die soon anyway. Those itchy patches will drive him crazy. You can deal with it.
Not only was I hurt, my heart was completely shattered. How could my parents treat me so unfairly? As I watched them leave, I couldn't find any tears. My eyes ached, but I couldn't cry. My grandparents comforted me and assured me that I'd be fine with them. They did stick to their words. They took me to a good hospital where new drugs were administered to me. According to them, my situation hadn't gotten better, mostly because I had been taking cheap drugs that could barely do anything. Luckily, my grandparents were both wealthy and loved me. I was homeschooled for 1 year until my situation improved. The flare-ups had reduced, and my skin had become nearly clear due to the skincare routine I was following alongside my drugs. I was registered at a private school afterward, which was 1 year and 3 months later. All the while, my parents never checked on me. In fact, they moved to another city, according to what I heard from my grandparents. Time flew, and I was finally done with college. I was 23 then, and my grandparents had gotten older. My grandfather had a company. It was so popular, but I could see that it had the potential to be. I talked to him about my ideas, and he made me the vice president so I could bring the ideas to life. And I did. Barely 2 years later, the company's fame had skyrocketed. Unfortunately, my grandparents both died in their sleep after my 25th birthday. It was so heartbreaking for me, as they were the only family members I had. I ensured to give them a befitting funeral. My parents suddenly showed up one day after their funeral. They were demanding for the company. According to them, I didn't belong to the family, so I didn't deserve it. I argued that I was, since I was their son, but they refused.
We disowned you 15 years ago, so you aren't a part of our family. Leave the company to us.
I refused. I wasn't going to let them take the company I'd worked so hard for. Fortunately, while we were arguing, a man walked in and introduced himself as my grandfather's lawyer. He also revealed that my grandfather wrote his will. My parents immediately began dancing in excitement. We all sat down, and the lawyer began. It was very brief. Apparently, my grandfather had more properties than I thought, and also a fat bank account. And well, he willed 90% of his properties to me, and the other 10% to orphanages around. My parents couldn't believe their ears. They tried to argue, but the lawyer also provided a video of my grandfather saying it, so they were convinced that it wasn't a lie. They immediately went on their knees, begging me.
Your brother is in a critical condition. Help us, please.
It turned out that my brother had been living a very wayward life. He was a thief, a gambler, a liar, among other things. He'd gotten my parents in and out of jail several times. The last one that landed him in the hospital was worse. He'd broken into someone's house to steal, but a fire had started, and he got trapped in. Before he could be rescued, he'd gotten burnt severely. He was at a hospital and needed treatment immediately, but my parents had gone broke. They'd used their money in paying off several debts he owed. Before the fire incident, they were forced to sell their first house to pay a gang he'd gambled with, and with the remaining money, they'd gotten a smaller house. They'd planned to pay my brother's bill and move to a bigger house, but they got no inheritance. I had no plan to render any help to them. I chased them out, threatening to report them to the cops if they dared to show themselves before me again. That was the only way I could get back at them for abandoning me. The universe showed its back to them once again. By the time they reached home, they discovered that the community had burned their small house, alongside everything they had in it. Apparently, they'd found out that Freddie had accidentally caused the fire while he was trying to steal from the family. There was a candle on, and he'd kicked something that hit it. The only way to get back at him was to burn my parents' house. They cried their eyes out, but no one came to their aid. They had no one to turn to. My brother eventually passed away, and my parents were forced to get menial jobs where the pay could barely even feed them well. They slept in the streets, where they often got beaten by dangerous guys. Meanwhile, my psoriasis was continuously kept under control, and no one knew unless I told them. I got married a few years later and had 2 beautiful kids with my wife. As for my parents, well, I heard about their demise 2 weeks after it happened. They had been robbed and stabbed by some crazy gang members for a few dollars. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our best to reply to your comment.
From inside, I could hear unmistakable sounds of intimacy. My heart pounded as I crept closer and peeked through the crack in the door. Judging by the sounds that were coming through the door, I could hear that Tom was in there with a woman and that they were passionately having sex, but I was not prepared to see who the woman was. The very sight of her made my blood run cold. Tom was there, with Alicia. They were tangled together, completely unaware of my presence. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started recording. I honestly don't know why I had the impulse to do so, but I was grateful later that I did. They went at it for dozens of minutes, but it wasn't just what they were doing that horrified me. It was what they said afterward.
Babe, I wish I could marry you instead of Jesse. You're the one that I truly love.
We can't do anything until your father is gone. If it comes out that we have been having an affair, then we're screwed. The prenup I signed with your father means I'll lose everything if I cheat. He has to disappear first.
Disappear? Do you mean that he needs to die?
Yes. I just need to find a way to make it happen.
I'll do it. I'll get rid of him. I would do anything for you. And after I've married Jessie, you can take care of her for me. We'll take out a big life insurance policy on her first. It'll be perfect.
Hi, my name is Jessie, and this is the story of how my life almost fell apart because of a man named Tom. At first, I thought I'd met the perfect partner. Tom was charming, attentive, and seemed to have his life together. Everyone that we knew all said that we appeared to be the perfect pairing, but that was all just a complete lie. As I got to know him, I started to notice the cracks. Cracks that would eventually split wide open and reveal something horrifying. Things were great between Tom and I, in the beginning. He was sweet, always bringing me little surprises and making me feel special. He would bring me flowers all the time and for no reason, and say it was because he was thinking of me and wanted me to have something beautiful. But that changed when he introduced me to his father, Richard, and his stepmother, Alicia. From the moment I met Alicia, something felt off. Very off.
This is my Jessie. Dad, Alicia, isn't she great?
Alicia's eyes lingered on Tom a moment too long before she turned to me with a wide smile. To me, though, the smile appeared very fake. There was no real warmth to it.
Oh, she's lovely, Tom. Just lovely. It's a pleasure to meet you, Jessie.
Yeah. It's a pleasure to meet you as well. Her words seemed kind, but there was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. Throughout the evening, I noticed little things. The way Tom and Alicia sat a bit too close, how her hand would linger on his arm, and the way they exchanged glances that felt intimate. I told myself I was imagining things. But as time went on, those moments became harder to ignore. One weekend, we went to visit Richard and Alicia for dinner. It was a fantastic meal that Richard had prepared, and he took great delight in watching us eat and enjoy it. During dessert, Alicia spilled some wine on her dress.
Oh dear, I'm so clumsy sometimes. Tom, could you help me in the kitchen find something I can clean this out with?
I can help.
No need, dear. Tom knows where everything is.
Yeah, it's no trouble. It's okay, Jessie. I'll be back in a bit.
They disappeared into the kitchen, and while Richard and I made small talk, I couldn't help but notice the low murmur of their voices and the occasional burst of laughter. When they finally returned, Tom looked flustered, and Alicia was all smiles. It felt very odd, so later as we drove home, I brought it up. Do you think it's a little strange how close you and Alicia are?
No, not really. Come on, Jess. She's just a caring stepmom. She's always been very loving. I think it's because she's wanted me to see her as my mom and not just my stepmom. Don't overthink it.
I wanted to believe him, so I let it go. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was just something about the way they were around each other that felt weird. After some time, I just convinced myself that I was being paranoid and that nothing was going on. Once I did, our relationship really began to flourish. A few months later, Tom proposed. It was a beautiful moment, and for a while, I forgot about my unease. We set a wedding date and started planning. Or rather, I started planning. Every time I asked Tom for help, he'd have an excuse.
I'm working extra hours to pay for the wedding. You're so good at organizing this stuff. You've got it handled, right?
I guess so. But I could really use some help. At first, I was understanding. Weddings are expensive, and I appreciated his effort. But then I noticed something strange. Despite all his overtime, our bank account wasn't growing the way it should. I mean, he was easily putting in over 10 hours a week in overtime, and that extra money should have been visible in the joint account, but it wasn't. Suspicious, I decided to pay him a surprise visit at work one night. I don't know what I expected to find, but I needed to confirm that he was indeed working overtime, and not just playing hooky in order to get out of helping me with the wedding planning. When I pulled into the parking lot of his office, I immediately noticed something odd. His car was there, but the lot was otherwise empty except for one other vehicle. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. Quietly, I made my way inside and up to his office. As I approached the door, I froze. From inside, I could hear unmistakable sounds of intimacy. My heart pounded as I crept closer and peeked through the crack in the door. Judging by the sounds that were coming through the door, I could hear that Tom was in there with a woman and that they were passionately having sex, but I was not prepared to see who the woman was. The very sight of her made my blood run cold. Tom was there with Alicia. They were tangled together, completely unaware of my presence. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started recording. I honestly don't know why I had the impulse to do so, but I was grateful later that I did. They went at it for dozens of minutes, but it wasn't just what they were doing that horrified me. It was what they said afterward.
Babe, I wish I could marry you instead of Jesse. You're the one that I truly love.
We can't do anything until your father is gone. If it comes out that we have been having an affair, then we're screwed. The prenup I signed with your father means I'll lose everything if I cheat. He has to disappear first.
Disappear? Do you mean that he needs to die?
Yes. I just need to find a way to make it happen.
I'll do it. I'll get rid of him. I would do anything for you. And after I've married Jessie, you can take care of her for me. We'll take out a big life insurance policy on her first. It'll be perfect.
That's a wonderful idea. We can use the money from the inheritance from your father and the life insurance from that dumb bitch to restart our life. Soon, it'll just be us.
Terrified, I slipped away as quietly as I could and drove straight to Richard's house. When I showed him the video, his face crumpled with anger and heartbreak. I hated having to show him it, but I knew that he needed to see it.
My own son. How could he do this? How could they do this?
I don't know, but there is something seriously wrong with them. They are planning to kill us. We need to go to the police right now. Together, we went to the police. Thankfully, they took the threat seriously and launched an investigation. The next day, officers went to arrest Tom and Alicia, but the pair fled, leading police on a high-speed chase that was covered on all the local news stations. It ended in a horrific crash that left both of them in vegetative states. The police told us that if they woke up, that they would be arrested, but their hands were tied otherwise. At the hospital, the doctors gave Richard and I all the details about what was going on with Tom and Alicia. We were given a choice. On one hand, we could keep them on life support with the hope they'd recover, although there was no guarantee that they would ever wake up. Or we could pull the plug and let them go. Richard didn't hesitate. Staring daggers at Alicia, he coldly told them what he wanted.
Pull the plug on Alicia. She doesn't deserve another chance. Are you 100% sure about this, sir? Yes. As far as I'm concerned, she died when I found out she was sleeping with my son.
Then he turned to me. There was a lot of sympathy in his eyes.
I won't blame you for whatever you decide about Tom. Do what you need to do.
Are you sure?
Yes. It is a hard choice, but it is your choice to make.
I looked at Tom, the man I thought I'd spend my life with, but all I could see was betrayal. He had cheated on me, and even worse, he'd planned to kill me. How could I forgive that? Pull the plug. He made his choices. Now I'm making mine. Seconds later, both Tom and Alicia passed away. Part of me felt angry that their deaths were so peaceful. After the callous way they had planned to kill Richard and I wanted them to suffer, but having them pass away would have to be justice enough. It took years of therapy to process everything, but eventually I found peace. I learned to trust my instincts and promise myself I'd never ignore red flags again. Today, I'm with someone who treats me with kindness and respect, and I finally feel safe. If there's one thing I've learned, I tell my friends, it's to trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. As for Richard, I haven't heard from him since then. I can't imagine that he is in a good place mentally. After all, he did lose his son and wife on that day, and even though we felt justified with our choice, it doesn't make it completely easy to deal with. In the end, Tom and Alicia thought they could get away with their plans, but they got unlucky, and their horrific ideas were discovered, and they paid the ultimate price. And while I wouldn't wish what I went through on anyone, I'm grateful for the strength it gave me. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us the most important lessons. Thanks for watching.
Then the night of my bachelor party arrived. My best man Derek had planned it 3 weeks before the wedding, and it was to be a rather tame night. We were going to go out as a group of guys and have steak and then go to a concert. Dinner was amazing, but at the concert I was separated from my friends during the show, and suddenly, 2 very large men grabbed me and dragged me away. They were so much stronger than I was, and although I fought back, they easily overpowered me and threw me into the trunk of a car. I felt the car drive away, and when it finally stopped, the same 2 men pulled me out of the trunk and then knocked me unconscious. When I woke up, I was tied to a chair and couldn't move. I tried to scream, but they had put a gag in my mouth.
Good. You are awake. We don't want any trouble from you so long as you play along. Then in a month, we will set you free.
Hello there. My name is Edward, and I know that some people have horrible in-laws, but my mother-in-law is a next-level sociopath. She did everything in her power to try to stop me from marrying her daughter, and I suppose she thought that she had good reasons, but I honestly think that she is just insane. It all started in high school. I met Amy in my junior year, and the 2 of us bonded over our love of reading. We met in the library and instantly started talking about all the books that we really enjoyed and our favorite authors. By the end of the first year, we were best friends and would go over to each other's houses to watch movies or to play games. However, Amy's mother never really took a liking to me.
Hey, Mom, can Edward stay over for dinner?
That annoying brat. Can't you find any friends that aren't poor and leech off of you?
He doesn't leech off of me, Mom. How can you be so mean to him?
It's okay, Amy. I'll just head home. I don't want to be a bother. It was always like that. She never really hid her dislike of me, and I suppose it stemmed from the fact that Amy's family was rather well off and that my family wasn't. In fact, my father worked as a janitor at the factory that Amy's father owned, a fact that Amy's mother always made sure to remind me. When we got older, we both went away to the same business college. Amy had her tuition all paid for by her parents, whereas I was forced to take out student loans and fight for scholarships. Thankfully, I was able to get more than a few though, and in the end, I didn't have to borrow that much money really. It was around the end of our last year that our friendship blossomed into a romantic one, and we realized that we loved each other. Both of us feared telling Amy's mother the good news, as we knew that she wouldn't see it as such. I had no doubt that Amy's mother would reject our relationship and demand that we break up. And sure enough, when we told her, she did exactly that.
Hey, Mom, I have some great news. Edward and I have come to realize that we make better partners than just friends. We are dating.
You can't be serious?
Yes, it's true. We realized that not only are we best friends, but that we love each other as well on a much deeper level as well.
Well, luckily that won't last. I will make sure that Amy breaks up with you, Edward. Simply put, you are not good enough for my daughter.
You're wrong, Mom. He is more than good enough for me. You are completely wrong about us.
So there we were. We knew that she did not give her blessing for our relationship, but neither of us really cared for it. After all, we had always known that she wouldn't be happy about us dating, but that we also did not care whether she did or did not. We loved one another, and that was all that mattered, really. At any rate, we decided that we would keep enjoying our lives, and that maybe one day that her mother would realize that we were a good fit for one another. First off, we needed to figure out what we would be doing for a living. It had always been assumed that Amy would work for her parents' company, but she wanted to strike out on her own and didn't want to rely on her parents' money anymore. I had an idea to buy houses for very cheap, put some work into making the homes beautiful, and then sell them. Amy didn't know much about home renovation, but she was excited to try and help me. And so we bought a small house for next to nothing, and over the course of a couple months, we changed the floors and walls and fixed a lot of things that would have made the house an eyesore. It went from nearly being condemned to something that everyone in the neighborhood wanted to own. A month after we listed it, we sold it for quite a bit more than what we had purchased it for. So much so that we were able to bank some of the money we made and buy another such house. By the time we were working on our fourth house, Amy was a natural at home renovations, and we were really beginning to make some good profit. So much so that we were able to renovate homes incredibly quickly. We eventually bought 2 houses and kept one for ourselves. It was perfect. We made sure that everything either of us could ever want was in the house. Amy wanted a sunroom, and we built one for our home. I wanted a large garage, and we got the permits and created one. It was quickly becoming our dream home, and I even saw it as a sign that I should propose, as I couldn't find anyone who was a better partner for me. I even tried to go to Amy's mother to get her blessing, hoping that she had changed her mind on me. Hi there. Listen, I know we have had a contentious past, but I really love your daughter and I want to marry her.
Never. You can never marry my daughter. I don't know how you've managed to convince her to date you or to waste our money on building your silly homes, but she'll realize that someone like you could never give her the kind of life she deserves.
That's where you're wrong. We make a perfect couple and work extremely well together. And we have never used your money. We have always used our own.
Whatever. You can try, but I'll make sure that you will never marry my daughter.
I don't see how you could stop us. We are in love, and I was just hoping that you would be able to move past this hatred of me and just accept that we make a great team.
You'll see.
The way that she responded made me feel very uncomfortable, but I figured I had tried to get her on board. The next few months were a blur, as Amy and I made wedding plans and got everything sorted for the big day. Then the night of my bachelor party arrived. My best man Derek had planned it 3 weeks before the wedding, and it was to be a rather tame night. We were going to go out as a group of guys and have steak and then go to a concert. Dinner was amazing, but at the concert I was separated from my friends during the show, and suddenly 2 very large men grabbed me and dragged me away. They were so much stronger than I was, and although I fought back, they easily overpowered me and threw me into the trunk of a car. I felt the car drive away, and when it finally stopped, the same 2 men pulled me out of the trunk and then knocked me unconscious. When I woke up, I was tied to a chair and couldn't move. I tried to scream, but they had put a gag in my mouth.
Good. You are awake. We don't want any trouble from you so long as you play along. Then in a month, we will set you free.
I nodded, but I was unsure what was going on. My mind raced with the possibilities of why these 2 men had kidnapped me, and why they only planned to hold me for a month, and then it dawned on me. My future mother-in-law must have hired them to prevent me from marrying Amy. It was the only thing that made sense. Luckily, the men would untie me every several hours to go and use the washroom, and during one such visit, I kicked one of the men in crotch and then made a break for the door. The other man tried to grab me, but I was thankfully faster, and once outside, I took off at a full run. I had no idea where I was, but after running for 10 minutes, I happened to encounter a police officer who helped me get home. The police took my description of my kidnappers, and although they listened to my suspicions about my mother-in-law, they didn't have any evidence to connect her to the men that had held me hostage. They basically said that the only way that they could prove that my mother-in-law was involved was if they managed to track the men down and have them confess that my mother-in-law had hired them. Amy thankfully agreed with my assessment and called up her mother to tell her that her plan had failed, only to get hung up on. Then, 20 minutes later, Amy's mother was at our front door.
Edward, you disgusting piece of crap. I tried to play nice. Those men wouldn't have hurt you, but you had to be persistent. Now you leave me with no choice.
My mother-in-law drew a gun and pointed it at me. Terrified, I jumped and ducked behind a wall just as she fired the gun at me. I heard the gun go off 3 or 4 times, and I was incredibly grateful that none of the bullets had hit me. It appeared that she was a terrible shot. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of shattering glass, and then a thump, and when I looked around the corner from my hiding spot, I saw Amy standing over her mother's body. She had hit her mother on the head with a large crystal vase that knocked her out. We then called the police, who rushed over and threw my mother-in-law in handcuffs. She spent that night in jail, and in the morning the police had good news for us. They had found the men that had kidnapped me based on the description of them that I had provided. Not only that, but the men agreed to rat on my mother-in-law in exchange for reduced sentences. They confessed that she hired them to kidnap me and hold me hostage till after the wedding. The plan was that when I didn't show up, that my mother-in-law would then convince Amy that I was no good for her and that I was unreliable. But when that plan failed, that she decided that the only way to prevent me from marrying Amy was to kill me. And so she grabbed her gun and tried to do just that. My mother-in-law was charged with attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The story about how a mother-in-law tried to have her son-in-law killed attracted the attention of the newspapers and local news stations who all interview Amy and I. Our story spread all over the country and garnered a lot of sympathy for Amy and I. We were even given some serious discounted prices on the next few homes we bought to flip and made an incredible profit off of them. Amy's mother, however, ended up going to prison for 10 years. From what we hear, she isn't doing very well behind bars. The story about how she tried to kill us spread very far indeed, and her fellow inmates did not approve of her foolish ideas. We received reports that at least once a month that she was in the infirmary recovering after a fellow inmate beat her up and either broke a rib or bruised her bad enough for her to need serious medical attention. To this day, she still hates me. As for us, Amy and I eloped and got married on a tropical island. When we got back, we got right back into work, and it didn't take long for our business to begin to thrive. So much so that we now have 4 teams that we hire to renovate houses for us now. We are now making more money than we could ever imagine, and are making plans to expand our family. So yes, I know a lot of people have some pretty awful in-laws, but how many can say that their mother-in-law tried to kill them?
As the charges piled up, Sandra sobbed louder.
Please, Susan. I didn't mean to. Help me, please.
Shut up, Sandra. Speak again, and I'll make sure your punishment is doubled. This is my court, and you're nothing but a criminal before me. I could see how scared Sandra got as she cried even more. Not only was she a thief, a drug addict, and a thug, she was also a drug trafficker. She'd even gambled with her parents' properties, the shock leading to their deaths. I couldn't believe how bad her life turned out to be. When it came time for me to deliver the sentence, I didn't hold back or pity her one bit. Miss Sandra, you have shown no regard for the law, for other people's lives, or for your own dignity. Your actions have caused immense pain, and for that, you will be held accountable. She cried louder, begging me to help her for old time's sake. I nearly laughed. Unknown to her, I was going to increase her punishment exactly for old time's sake. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For anyone you assault while serving your term, 3 months will be added to your jail term. High school was supposed to be the best time of your life, or at least that's what people said. But for me, it was a battlefield. A war I fought every single day. And at the center of that war was Sandra. Sandra wasn't always my enemy. In fact, during my first week at Franklin High, she had been friendly. She introduced herself with a smile that, at the time, seemed genuine.
Hi, I am Sandra. You're new, right? You'll love it here.
I thought I had made a friend. We sat together at lunch, talked about our favorite TV shows, and even exchanged numbers. But everything changed when a guy Sandra liked asked me out. From that moment, Sandra hated me. Even more so at homecoming, I walked in with the guy that Sandra liked. I wore a shimmering blue gown my mom had helped me pick out, turned heads as soon as I walked in. Compliments came from every corner. Classmates, teachers, even parents chaperoning the dance. I felt beautiful and confident. But Sandra didn't see it that way. She watched from the sidelines, her face tightening with every compliment I received.
She's not even that pretty. People probably just feel sorry for her because the dress is horrible.
I didn't hear her say it, but someone told me. I didn't believe it at first because there was no way Sandra would say such a thing about me. However, the next morning at school, Sandra ignored me. When I tried to sit with her at lunch, she made it clear I wasn't welcome.
This table's full, Susan. Maybe you should try over there. And you should stop forcing this friendship between us already. I told you, I don't like you.
Her voice was loud enough for everyone in the cafeteria to hear. Laughter rippled through the room as I picked up my tray and walked away. I was so embarrassed. She never told me she didn't like me. That was a lie. From that day on, Sandra made it her mission to make my life miserable. The rumors started first. Sandra would start rumors about me and make sure they spread. I would hear students gossiping about me anytime I walked by, always in whispers.
Did you hear? Susan's family is broke. That's why she wears the same shoes every day.
I also heard she begged the principal to let her into Franklin High. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. Sandra had a way of making people believe whatever she said. When she saw that I gave no reaction to that, she moved on to pranks. My locker was her favorite target. One morning, I opened it to find it stuffed with trash. Empty soda cans, crumpled papers, even a banana peel. The stench was unbearable.
Oops, must have mistaken it for the dumpster.
Her group of followers burst into laughter as I fought back tears, cleaning up the mess. Another time, she poured water on my chair during math class. I didn't notice until I sat down, and by then, it was too late.
Wet yourself, Susan?
The entire class erupted in laughter as I fled to the bathroom. I was so humiliated. Physical bullying wasn't off limits for Sandra either. She'd accidentally bump into me in the hallways, sending my books flying.
Watch where you're going, clumsy.
She was visibly bullying me, but no one ever called her out. She was the queen of the school, untouchable in everyone's eyes. One evening, as I was walking home from the supermarket, two masked girls appeared out of nowhere, cornered me, and beat me up. They broke my hand and ran away with everything I had bought. I was certain one of them was Sandra. I recognized her body structure and hair, but I had no evidence to prove it. The next day, when I didn't go to school because I was admitted to the hospital, Sandra spread a rumor that I was pregnant, and even posted it in our class group. So many students wrote hurtful comments, which made me feel incredibly sad and depressed. The worst incident happened during gym class. We were playing handball, and Sandra made me her target.
Catch, loser!
The ball slammed into my face, knocking me to the ground. Blood dripped from my nose, and Sandra smirked, feigning concern.
Oh no, are you okay? It was an accident.
The coach believed her, of course. Sandra always knew how to play innocent. By the end of junior year, I started eating lunch in the library to avoid her. It became a place where I could hide from the constant torment. The librarians noticed my frequent visits and would sometimes ask if I was okay, but I never told them the truth. I was too ashamed. One day, during a school assembly, the principal announced a talent show.
Show us what makes you unique.
I loved singing and decided to audition. For once, I wanted to do something for myself, something that made me happy. When I performed, the audience was mesmerized, captivated by my voice. For a brief moment, I felt like I belonged. But Sandra couldn't let me have that moment.
What a show-off. Bet she thinks she's a star now.
The next day, she circulated a doctored video of my performance, adding fake flat notes and off-key screeches. The students, both those who'd witnessed me perform, stupidly followed her, pretending like I truly didn't know how to sing.
Wow, Susan. Didn't know you were that bad.
I stopped singing after that. Senior year brought some relief. Sandra was preoccupied with applying to colleges, but she still found time to torment me. During prom season, she spread another rumor.
Susan's going alone because no one wants to be seen with her.
It wasn't true. I chose not to attend prom because I couldn't handle another night of her antics. But her words still stung. By the time graduation rolled around, I was counting down the days until I could leave Franklin High behind. When I walked across the stage to accept my diploma, Sandra tripped me.
Oops, clumsy again.
The crowd laughed, but I didn't care anymore. I picked myself up, smiled, and kept walking. Leaving Franklin High was the best thing that ever happened to me. However, life after wasn't all roses. Although Sandra wasn't present again, she really left bad imprints in my life. While I had escaped Sandra and her cruelty, the scars she left behind didn't heal so easily. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, flinching at loud noises and doubting my every move. I couldn't make friends because I was afraid of getting betrayed. Whenever I was in crowded places and people laughed, I would think they were mocking me. It was hard to connect with people. Against my wish, I started isolating myself. Therapy wasn't something I ever thought I'd need, but it became my lifeline. For a full year, I paused furthering my education and sat in that small office, pouring out my pain to a patient therapist who assured me over and over again that I was worth more than the bullying I had endured.
You're not broken, Susan. You're healing.
When I started to loosen up, it was even harder. I lost friendships because I was always scared of them telling people things about me, even if I never told them anything. If I saw my friends talking to anyone, I would think it was about me. And if anyone close to them tried to talk to me, I would think my friends spread stuff about me and those people were coming to confirm. But that wasn't the case. At the end, I lost the few friends I managed to make because they couldn't deal with me. However, after more months receiving therapy, I was starting to get myself back. I made new friends and trusted them. My new friends were good people because they learned about my troubles and helped me with them. I wasn't alone anymore. I was able to start revealing things to them, knowing that they wouldn't tell it to anyone. They helped me make more friends, helped me fully gain back my confidence. By the time I felt ready to step back into the world, I knew one thing for certain. I wanted to make a difference. That's why I decided to go to law school. Law school was hard, but it gave me purpose. I threw myself into my studies, determined to help those who couldn't help themselves. Every time I passed an exam or won a mock trial, I felt a piece of my confidence return. I also helped students at my school whenever I saw them getting bullied. One time, I helped a girl who wanted to study nursing instead of law, but got forced to study law by her parents. I helped her sue them, and at the end, she was allowed to study what she wanted, and also got out of her parents' grip because it was discovered that they were abusive. After graduation, I became a prosecutor, handling cases that ranged from petty theft to violent assaults. I built a reputation for being tough but fair, and I was proud of the work I did. Soon, I became one of the youngest judges in the city due to my uprightness. But nothing could have prepared me for the day Sandra walked back into my life. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the case landed on my desk. A woman had been brutally attacked by a drug addict high out of her mind. The victim had suffered severe injuries, barely surviving the ordeal. The case was open and shut, and the evidence was so overwhelming. As the judge overseeing the trial, I prepared myself for another day in court. But when the defendant was led in, my breath caught in my throat. It was Sandra. She looked nothing like the queen bee I remembered from high school. Her hair was unkempt, her face gaunt, and her once bright eyes were dull and sunken. For a moment, I thought I must be imagining it, but then she recognized me and even called my name. Memories of all the pain she had caused came rushing back, overwhelming me. I was determined to get my revenge. It seemed like Sandra knew it because she immediately burst into tears. The prosecutor presented the case, detailing Sandra's crimes. Not only had she attacked an innocent woman, but she had also been involved in multiple instances of theft and vandalism to fund her addiction. As the charges piled up, Sandra sobbed louder.
Please, Susan. I didn't mean to. Help me, please.
Shut up, Sandra. Speak again, and I'll make sure your punishment is doubled. This is my court, and you're nothing but a criminal before me. I could see how scared Sandra got as she cried even more. Not only was she a thief, a drug addict, and a thug, she was also a drug trafficker. She'd even gambled with her parents' properties, the shock leading to their deaths. I couldn't believe how bad her life turned out to be. When it came time for me to deliver the sentence, I didn't hold back or pity her one bit. Miss Sandra, you have shown no regard for the law, for other people's lives, or for your own dignity. Your actions have caused immense pain, and for that, you will be held accountable. She cried louder, begging me to help her for old time's sake. I nearly laughed. Unknown to her, I was going to increase her punishment exactly for old time's sake. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For anyone you assault while serving your term, 3 months will be added to your jail term. Sandra collapsed on the floor and wailed louder. 10 years should have been enough for her case, but I wanted her to be punished more.
Please, Susan. I'm sorry. I'll do anything.
Anything? Where was that attitude when you tormented me for years? Where was your remorse when you ruined my life? This is justice, Sandra. The kind you never thought you'd face. As the bailiffs dragged her out of the courtroom, she screamed for mercy.
Susan, please. I'm begging you.
But I didn't look away. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. To finish her off properly, I made sure she was sent to the nastiest prison and given the worst cell to stay in. After 1 year and she didn't assault anyone, I paid someone to pay a warder in the prison to set Sandra up with someone. After a fight broke out between the two and the prisoner lied against Sandra, 3 months was added to her jail term. I couldn't be happier. She was completely at my mercy. If you were me, will you do more?